When the Galactic Academy's most feared combat instructor Zoktan the Ripper meets his match in Sergeant Maya Chen, a seemingly ordinary human exchange student, the entire Deathworld survival class learns that Earth's fragile representatives might just be the most dangerous species in the galaxy. What starts as routine intimidation becomes a legendary beatdown that reshapes interstellar military doctrine forever. The training hall of the Galactic Military Academy fell silent as Instructor Zoktan entered, his massive frame casting shadows that seemed to swallow the overhead lighting whole. Standing nearly 3 meters tall, the Korvaxi Predator moved with the fluid grace of something that had evolved specifically to end other things. His forearms rippled with corded muscle beneath mottled gray hide, while twin rows of razor-sharp teeth gleamed behind a perpetual snarl. "Good morning, fresh meat," Zoktan rumbled, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made seasoned warriors check their weapon safeties twice. The assembled students, a colorful collection of the galaxy's supposedly toughest species, collectively held their breath. Welcome to Introduction to Deathworld Survival, where your delusions of competence come to die. Behind those glowing amber eyes lay the kind of combat record that made military historians weep with joy: 847 victories, 0 defeats, and a teaching methodology that involved considerably more actual violence than most educational institutions preferred to advertise. The Centauri cadet in the front row, a blue-skinned specimen named Blip, visibly trembled as those predatory eyes swept across the assembled group. "Some of you," Zoktan continued, beginning his traditional first-day prowl around the training mat, "come from worlds where the apex predators have been extinct for millennia. Others hail from peaceful garden worlds where the most dangerous creature is whatever passes for a house pet." His laugh sounded like rocks grinding together in a cement mixer. "Today you learn what real predators look like." The Vulcani twins in the second row exchanged nervous glances. Even the notoriously aggressive Saber Squadron representatives seemed suddenly interested in studying their boots. This was exactly how Zoktan preferred his students: terrified, attentive, and acutely aware that their previous combat training was about as useful as a chocolate teapot in a plasma furnace. "Your first lesson," the instructor announced, flexing all 4 arms simultaneously in a display that made several cadets reach reflexively for weapons that weren't there, "is understanding the food chain. Some species hunt, others get hunted. Today we determine which category." The training hall door hissed open with the kind of timing that suggested the universe had a twisted sense of humor. "Sorry I'm late," came a cheerful voice from the doorway. "Got lost looking for the bathroom." Every head turned to observe what appeared to be the most underwhelming specimen ever to grace a military academy. The newcomer stood barely half Zoktan's height, possessed only 2 arms like some sort of evolutionary afterthought, and wore the kind of apologetic smile that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else discussing anything else with anyone else. "Sergeant Maya Chen, reporting for Deathworld survival training," she continued, apparently oblivious to the predatory stare now focused entirely on her pink, fragile-looking form. Her uniform bore the insignia of something called the Earth Defense Forces, which sounded about as intimidating as a paper airplane squadron. Zoktan's snarl widened into something that might have been amusement if predators were capable of such gentle emotions. "Ah yes, the human exchange student." The way he pronounced human made it sound like a particularly disappointing variety of lunch meat. "Class, observe our final participant. Notice the complete absence of natural weapons, no claws, no fangs, no protective armor plating. These creatures somehow managed to evolve on what they laughably call a death world, despite being constructed entirely of soft, breakable components." Maya nodded agreeably, as if Zoktan had just complimented her choice of breakfast cereal. "That's pretty much accurate, actually." "Indeed," Zoktan purred, already anticipating the educational value of demonstrating proper predatory technique on such obviously cooperative prey. "How wonderfully convenient." "Now then," Zoktan announced, his forearms spreading wide like some nightmarish conductor preparing for a symphony of pain. "Let us begin with basic predatory positioning. I require a volunteer to demonstrate proper combat stance." The silence that followed was so complete that the Academy's ventilation system sounded like a hurricane. Every alien student suddenly discovered fascinating details in the training hall's floor tiles, ceiling panels, or literally anywhere else that wasn't within Zoktan's field of vision. "Excellent," the Korvaxi instructor purred, his amber eyes settling on the unfortunate Blip. "The Centauri will suffice." Blip's blue complexion immediately shifted several shades paler, approaching something that resembled spoiled milk. "But sir, I haven't finished reviewing the safety protocols, and my medical forms aren't fully processed, and I think I might be allergic to—" "Move," Zoktan rumbled. The cadet shuffled onto the training mat with all the enthusiasm of someone approaching their own execution, which, given Zoltan's teaching methods, wasn't entirely inaccurate. Observe, the instructor continued, circling the trembling Centauri like a shark that had discovered a particularly tasty school of fish. Proper predatory stance requires balance, reach advantage, and psychological dominance. With fluid precision, Zakan shifted into what could only be described as controlled lethality made manifest. His forearms positioned themselves at optimal striking angles, massive frame coiled like a spring loaded with malicious intent, and those razor-sharp teeth gleamed in a smile that belonged in nightmares. The key, he explained, while Blip visibly contemplated various religious conversions, is establishing your position at the apex of the food chain. Your opponent must understand, instantly and completely, that they are prey. His top right arm moved in a demonstration strike that stopped mere millimeters from Blip's throat. The Centauri made a sound like a deflating balloon. That's actually pretty impressive, Maya observed from the sidelines, sounding like she was commenting on the weather rather than witnessing a masterclass in controlled violence. But would you mind if I tried a slightly different approach? The training hall fell even quieter, if such a thing were physically possible. Several cadets turned to stare at the human with the kind of expression typically reserved for watching someone volunteer to pet a rabid war beast. Zaktan's laugh rumbled through the chamber like distant thunder. By all means, little human, please enlighten us with your species' approach to combat. The condescension in his voice was thick enough to cut with industrial equipment. Well, Maya said, stepping forward with the same casual confidence she might display while ordering coffee, humans have this weird thing where we don't really do the whole intimidation display. We're more about efficiency. Efficiency, Zaktan repeated, as if she'd just claimed that gravity worked backwards on weekends. How wonderfully naive. Class, observe what passes for combat doctrine among species that evolved without proper predatory instincts. The instructor released poor Blip, who immediately scurried back to the safety of the student group like his tail was on fire. Several cadets were now whispering among themselves, and the universal translator helpfully provided snippets of their conversation. 10 credits says the human doesn't last 30 seconds, hissed a saber warrior. That's generous, replied his companion. I'm betting she surrenders before contact. 20 credits on Zaktan ending this in under 15 seconds, added one of the Vulcani twins. Maya appeared entirely oblivious to the wagering frenzy developing around her potential demise. Instead, she was studying Zaktan's combat stance with the kind of academic interest that suggested she found the whole situation mildly entertaining rather than life-threatening. The problem with intimidation displays, she continued conversationally, is that they assume your opponent cares about being intimidated. Humans have this quirk where fear just makes us more focused. Zaktan's predatory grin widened to display even more teeth, an achievement that several cadets hadn't thought anatomically possible. How fascinating, and what, pray tell, do humans focus on when faced with superior predators? Oh, that's easy, Maya replied, rolling her shoulders in what appeared to be casual stretching, but caused every combat-trained observer to suddenly pay much closer attention to her movement patterns. We focus on winning. The Korvaxi instructor's forearms flexed in anticipation. This was going to be even more educational than usual. Very well, Sergeant Chen. Let us see how efficiently your species handles actual predation. He gestured toward the training mat with mock courtesy. After you. Maya stepped onto the mat with the same unhurried confidence she'd displayed since arriving. Thanks, this should be fun. The betting intensified. Standard Academy combat protocols, Zaktan announced, settling into his predatory stance with the casual confidence of someone who had never lost a fight and saw no reason to start worrying about that record now. First contact in 3, 2, 1. He launched himself forward with the kind of explosive speed that had made the Korvaxi the galaxy's most feared military contractors. Forearms moved in perfect coordination, designed to overwhelm any opponent through sheer aggressive superiority. It was a technique that had worked flawlessly for 847 consecutive victories. Maya wasn't there anymore. The human had moved sideways with a fluid grace that seemed to violate several basic laws of physics, not the dramatic energy-wasting acrobatics that most species favored, but a precise, economical shift that put her exactly where Zaktan's attack wasn't going to be. Interesting opening, she commented, as if critiquing a particularly complex dance move. Very committed to the forward momentum. Zaktan's predatory instincts, finely tuned through millennia of evolution, suddenly began transmitting warning signals that his conscious mind wasn't quite ready to accept. Something was wrong. Prey didn't move like that. Prey didn't sound like that. And Prey definitely didn't provide running commentary on combat techniques while actively being hunted. He recovered quickly, spinning to face her with all the lethal efficiency that had made him a legend. Lucky dodge, little human. Let's see how you handle a proper assault." This time he approached more cautiously, using his reach advantage to probe her defenses. The first strike came from his upper left arm, a testing blow designed to gauge her reaction speed. Maya slipped it with minimal effort, her movement so smooth it appeared almost lazy. "You telegraph from the shoulder," she observed helpfully. "Makes it easy to read the angle." The second strike followed immediately, a combination attack from two arms simultaneously that should have overwhelmed any opponent's ability to track multiple threats. Maya ducked under one, redirected the second with what appeared to be a gentle push, and somehow ended up closer to Zaktan rather than farther away. "That's better," she said approvingly. "But you're still thinking like you're hunting something that runs away." Zaktan's amber eyes narrowed, as several very disturbing realizations began forcing their way into his consciousness. The human wasn't just avoiding his attacks, she was analyzing them, learning them, studying him like he was some sort of training exercise rather than a galactic-class predator. "What exactly are you?" he growled, all four arms now moving in a coordinated assault pattern that had never failed to connect with its intended target. "Sergeant, Special Forces, Earth Defense," Maya replied conversationally, while somehow flowing around his strikes like water avoiding rocks. 12 years active duty, specializing in asymmetric warfare against superior opponents. The words hit Zaktan's consciousness about the same time his overextended upper right arm met Maya's counterattack. What followed was a textbook demonstration of leverage, timing, and applied biomechanics that would have impressed physics professors across the galaxy. Maya caught his wrist at precisely the moment of maximum extension, stepped inside his guard with movements that were almost too fast to track, and applied what humans technically called an armbar, but what the rest of the galaxy was about to learn to call a really bad day. The sound of Korvaxi bones snapping echoed through the training hall like a gunshot. Zaktan's roar of pain and shock shattered the stunned silence that had fallen over the assembled students. The galaxy's most feared combat instructor, the undefeated champion of 847 fights, crashed to the training mat clutching his mangled arm, while his nervous system tried to process what had just happened to his legendary invincibility. "Oh, that sounded unpleasant," Maya said, stepping back and dusting off her uniform with the kind of casual attention to detail that suggested breaking predator limbs was just another Tuesday for her. "You might want to have the medical team look at that. Looks like a clean break, but you never know with joint damage." Zaktan writhed on the mat, his three remaining functional arms clutching the fourth while his amber eyes stared at the human in something approaching existential horror. Pain was secondary to the complete collapse of his understanding of how the universe worked. "The leverage point was your overextension," Maya continued, apparently under the impression that this was still a teaching moment. "Korvaxi anatomy gives you great reach, but it also creates vulnerability windows when you commit to power strikes. Basic physics, really." She looked around at the assembled students, who were staring at her with the kind of expression typically reserved for witnessing natural disasters or religious revelations. "The key is understanding that bigger doesn't automatically mean better," she explained, while Zaktan continued to emit sounds that suggested his vocal cords were having difficulty processing recent events. "Humans evolved fighting things that were bigger, stronger, and meaner than us, so we got really good at finding weak points." The Zentauri cadet named Blip was making a sound like a malfunctioning air recycler. Several other students appeared to be questioning fundamental aspects of their worldview. Maya glanced down at the still writhing Korvaxi instructor, then back at the class with the same pleasant expression she'd worn since arriving. Next, the silence that followed was so profound that it seemed to bend space-time around itself. Somewhere in the back of the training hall, a credit chip hit the floor as nervous fingers lost their grip. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Nobody volunteered. The stunned silence stretched on for what felt like geological epochs. 23 of the galaxy's supposedly toughest military cadets sat frozen in various states of shock, their combat training manuals suddenly seeming about as relevant as ancient poetry. The Vulcani twins had stopped breathing entirely, which was impressive considering their species could hold their breath for up to 40 minutes when necessary. Blip the Zentauri was the first to break the spell, pointing a trembling blue finger at Maya while making sounds that the universal translator was diplomatically rendering as incomprehensible stammering. "Did she just?" began one of the saber warriors. "She broke Zaktan," finished his companion, sounding like he was reporting the heat death of the universe. "She actually broke Zaktan." The training hall's emergency medical alert began wailing as sensors detected elevated stress indicators from approximately every life form in the facility. Within 30 seconds, the Academy's trauma response team burst through the doors like they were expecting to find casualties from a small war. Doc Helix, The Academy's chief medical officer and a being who had seen everything the galaxy's most violent species could do to each other, took one look at the scene and stopped dead in his tracks. His 6 eyes blinked in sequence as he processed the sight of Zocton the Ripper writhing on the training mat, while a small human female stood nearby looking mildly concerned about proper medical procedure. "What in the 7 burning moons happened here?" Doc Helix demanded. "Training exercise," Maya replied helpfully. "I think we had a slight miscalculation in the force application. My fault, really. I should have adjusted for the bone density differences between human and Korvaxi anatomy." The medical team swarmed over Zocton with the kind of professional efficiency that came from years of treating combat-related injuries. The difference was that usually those injuries happened to students, not instructors, especially not legendary instructors who were supposed to be physically incapable of losing fights. "Clean fracture of the upper right ulna," Doc Helix announced, running his medical scanner over the damaged limb. "Textbook precision, almost surgical." He looked up at Maya, with something that might have been professional admiration if it wasn't mixed with deep concern about the fundamental nature of reality. "Oh good," Maya said, sounding relieved. "I was worried I might have caused joint damage. That would have been much harder to repair." While the medical team worked, Maya turned her attention to the shell-shocked students. "So, anyone want to try some basic defensive techniques? Nothing fancy, just some simple ways to avoid getting hurt when someone bigger than you decides you look tasty." The response was immediate and universal. Every alien in the room simultaneously took several steps backward. "Come on," Maya encouraged, apparently interpreting their terror as shyness. "It's really not that complicated. The key is understanding that every species has vulnerabilities. You just need to know where to look." She gestured toward the Vulcani twins. "Take your people, for instance. Incredible strength, natural armor plating, but your joints are designed for power, not flexibility. A little pressure in the right spot, and all that muscle works against you." Both twins looked down at their joints with newfound suspicion, as if their own anatomy had suddenly become a potential enemy. The training hall doors burst open again, this time admitting a parade of Academy instructors who had been drawn by the medical alert and what could only be described as concerning rumors spreading through the facility at light speed. Commander Thex, the Academy's head of combat instruction, led the charge with an expression that suggested someone was about to have a very bad day. "Report," he barked, then stopped as he noticed Zocton being loaded onto a medical transport gurney. Did someone actually—" "Training accident," Maya said before anyone else could speak. "I'm afraid I miscalculated the force requirements for a demonstration. Completely my responsibility." Commander Thex stared at her with the kind of expression typically reserved for discovering that the laws of physics had taken a vacation. "You injured instructor Zocton during a training demonstration." "Well, injured is a strong word," Maya replied thoughtfully. "More like provided him with an educational experience about human combat doctrine. Though I admit the educational component probably got lost somewhere around the bone-breaking part." The assembled instructors exchanged glances that conveyed volumes of information, none of it particularly comforting. Several of them began backing toward the exit with the kind of casual urgency that suggested they had suddenly remembered important appointments elsewhere. "Perhaps," Commander Thex said carefully, "you could explain exactly what human combat doctrine entails." Maya brightened noticeably, apparently delighted to find someone interested in her area of expertise. "Oh, it's really quite straightforward. Humans evolved on what you'd classify as a Class 12 Deathworld, which means we spent roughly 2 million years being hunted by things that were bigger, stronger, faster, and meaner than us." She began counting on her fingers with the casual air of someone discussing grocery lists. Saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, cave bears, other humans who hadn't figured out agriculture yet. Pretty much everything on Earth wanted to eat us, and we were too small and slow to run away effectively. The alien students were listening with the kind of rapt attention typically reserved for religious experiences or impending disasters. "So we got really good at 2 things, making tools and finding weak spots. Every predator has them, every armored creature has joints, every powerful opponent has leverage points. The trick is learning to see them." A collective shudder ran through the assembled aliens as they began to understand the implications. Earth hadn't produced a species that was particularly strong or fast or well-armed. Earth had produced a species that was specifically designed to kill things that were stronger, faster, and better armed than they were. "Of course," Maya continued cheerfully, "we also developed complex social structures, art, music, literature, and a surprisingly sophisticated sense of humor about the whole situation, but the combat applications tend to be what people notice first." Blip raised a trembling hand. "Sergeant Chen, when you say other humans, do you mean—" "Oh yes," Maya nodded. Humans have been perfecting techniques for fighting other humans for approximately 50,000 years. It's been quite educational. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of several cadets quietly updating their wills. Somewhere in the distance, Zacton's voice echoed through the academy corridors as the medical team transported him to the infirmary. She's not prey. She's not prey. Someone needs to update the classification protocols. Maya looked around at the faces staring at her with newfound respect, terror, and something that might have been worship. So, she said brightly, who wants to learn proper joint manipulation techniques? Within 48 hours of what the Academy administration had diplomatically dubbed the human incident, emergency protocol meetings were being held in conference rooms across the facility. The resulting documentation, labeled Emergency Revision 7.3, Human Combat Protocols, ran to nearly 300 pages and included helpful diagrams showing which joints could be manipulated by seemingly fragile bipedal organisms. The first new regulation, printed in bold lettering and translated into 17 galactic languages, read, "Under no circumstances should human exchange students be classified as easy targets or practice opponents without prior consultation with qualified xenobiologists, military strategists, and psychiatric counselors." Meanwhile, Zacton the Ripper sat in the Academy medical bay with his upper right arm encased in regenerative casting, staring at the wall with the 1,000-yard stare of someone whose entire worldview had been systematically demolished by a cheerful human female. Doc Helix had assured him that the bone would heal completely within 6 standard days, but the damage to his legendary reputation appeared to be considerably more permanent. She asked if I was feeling better. He muttered to his medical chart, which remained diplomatically silent. She brought me soup from the commissary, said it would help with the calcium absorption. His voice carried the tone of someone reporting alien abduction experiences. The soup was actually quite good. 3 doors down the corridor, Maya had been assigned a temporary office that was rapidly being converted into the Academy's first-ever human warfare theory classroom. The sign on the door, hastily printed by Academy maintenance, read, "Instructor Chen Man, office hours by appointment only. Protective gear recommended." The protective gear recommendation had been added after Caddick Blip's enthusiastic attempt to demonstrate human-style leverage manipulation had resulted in him accidentally throwing his Vulcani sparring partner through a wall. The wall had required repairs. The Vulcani had required therapy. "The problem with your traditional galactic military doctrine," Maya explained to a group of 12 cadets who were sitting considerably farther away than Academy regulations technically required, "is that it assumes everyone plays by the same rules. Bigger species intimidate smaller ones. Stronger species dominate weaker ones. More advanced technology beats less advanced technology." She gestured at a holographic display showing standard combat formations used by major galactic powers. "These tactics work great when everyone agrees to fight the same way, but humans never got that memo." The Zentari cadet raised his hand tentatively. "But Instructor Chen, how do we adapt our existing training? My people have been using intimidation displays for over 6,000 years. "Keep using them," Maya replied. "Intimidation displays are excellent for establishing dominance against species that care about being intimidated. But maybe add some backup plans for when you run into something that thinks your scary face is adorable." She pulled up a tactical analysis of the previous day's training session, which had been recorded from 17 different angles by Academy security systems. The footage was already being studied by military strategists across the galaxy, though most of them were having difficulty believing what they were seeing. "Watch this part," Maya said, pointing to the moment where she slipped Zacton's first attack. "He's committed to forward momentum, which means his center of gravity is moving in a predictable direction. Simple physics says that if you can redirect that momentum, size becomes irrelevant." The assembled cadets watched in fascination and horror as the recording showed their legendary instructor being systematically dismantled by what appeared to be applied engineering principles. "Of course," Maya continued, "this only works if you can actually execute the technique properly. Which brings us to today's practical exercise." The collective sound of chairs scraping backward as every cadet simultaneously tried to increase their distance from the instructor was clearly audible. "Relax," Maya said with a grin that was probably meant to be reassuring but had roughly the same effect as a predator showing teeth. "We're starting with basic theory. Nobody's breaking any bones today." She paused thoughtfully. "Probably." Down in the Academy's communications center, reports were flowing in from across the galaxy as news of the human incident spread through military channels. The official incident report had been classified at the highest levels, but somehow details kept leaking out in increasingly dramatic forms. The Corvaxi High Command had reportedly convened an emergency session to discuss human threat assessment protocols. The Saber clans were said to be revising their entire approach to interspecies conflict. Even the notoriously aggressive Volcani Empire had quietly begun requesting detailed information about Earth's military capabilities. "I heard she didn't even break a sweat," whispered one instructor to another in the academy cafeteria. "My cousin's friend was there," replied his companion. "Said she offered to teach advanced techniques after she broke his arm." Advanced techniques? What could be more advanced than breaking Zaktan's arm? The question hung in the air with the kind of ominous weight that suggested the galaxy might soon find out. Back in her improvised classroom, Maya was wrapping up the day's lesson by explaining the finer points of psychological warfare to a group of cadets who were taking notes with the desperate intensity of beings who had suddenly realized they knew absolutely nothing about combat. "The key thing to remember," she concluded, "is that humans have been fighting each other for so long that we've basically turned warfare into an art form. Every technique you can think of, we've already tried it, perfected it, and developed 17 different counters for it." She looked around at the terrified faces staring back at her. Any questions? Nobody raised their hand. The Galactic Military Academy's monthly awards ceremony had never before required additional security protocols, but then again, they had never before honored someone whose teaching methods included the systematic dismantling of legendary combat instructors. The ceremony hall buzzed with nervous energy as representatives from dozens of species gathered to witness what would undoubtedly become the most diplomatically significant event in Academy history. Commander Thex stood at the podium, reading from prepared remarks that had been revised 17 times by the Academy's legal department and twice by representatives from the Galactic Diplomatic Corps. "Today, we recognize the exceptional contributions of Sergeant Maya Chen to the advancement of interspecies combat understanding and the expansion of our tactical perspectives." The applause was polite, respectful, and tinged with the kind of nervous energy that suggested most of the audience was clapping while mentally calculating escape routes. Maya sat in the front row, wearing her dress uniform and the same pleasant expression she had maintained throughout her entire academy experience. To her left sat Zaktan, his arm fully healed but his pride still showing stress fractures. The legendary Korvaxi instructor had spent the past week in what could only be described as intensive self-reflection about the nature of predation, prey, and the uncomfortable possibility that he might have fundamentally misunderstood both concepts. Furthermore, Commander Thex continued, "The Academy is pleased to announce the creation of a new position, Cross-Species Combat Consultant, focusing on asymmetric warfare doctrine and, alternative approaches to conflict resolution." More applause, this time accompanied by the sound of several military attachés frantically taking notes. Word had already spread through diplomatic channels that at least 6 major galactic powers were preparing formal requests for human military advisors. The Saber clans, in particular, had reportedly offered what could only be described as embarrassingly large compensation packages for anyone willing to teach their warriors how to fight like humans. When the ceremony concluded, Zaltan approached Maya with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to take absolutely nothing for granted about human behavior. His amber eyes, once so confident in their predatory assessment of the universe, now held something that looked remarkably like humility. "Sergeant Chen," he began, his voice carrying none of its former condescension, "I owe you an apology and an explanation." Maya looked up at him with the same friendly interest she might show a neighbor discussing the weather. "No apology necessary, instructor, though I'd be curious about the explanation. For 847 fights, I believed that combat was about demonstrating superiority, showing prey that they were prey, and predators that I was the superior predator." He flexed his newly healed arm carefully. "You taught me that combat is actually about solving problems, and humans, it appears, are exceptionally good problem solvers." "We've had lots of practice," Maya agreed. "Anything else?" Zaktan took what might have been a deep breath, though Korvaxi respiratory systems made the gesture difficult to interpret. "I would be honored if you would consider teaching me some of these problem-solving techniques. Properly this time, with adequate safety protocols and medical staff on standby." "I'd be happy to," Maya said, as if he had just asked her to recommend a good restaurant. "Fair warning, though, human combat techniques tend to be pretty hard on the ego. We don't really do the whole honorable defeat thing. When we fight to win, and we're not particularly concerned about looking impressive while we do it." "I think," Zaktan said quietly, "that my ego has already received all the adjustment it can handle." 1 month later, the Academy's new alternative combat doctrine classroom was filled to capacity with some of the galaxy's most elite military personnel. Maya stood at the front of the room, gesturing at a holographic display that showed human military history from the Bronze Age through the recent outer colony conflicts. "Today we're covering basic defensive concepts for smaller organisms facing larger opponents," she announced to the assembled group of aliens, who were quite possibly the most dangerous beings in known space, but who were currently taking notes like first-year cadets. The key principle is that size and strength are just variables in the equation. They're advantages, but they're not decisive advantages if you know how to work around them. She highlighted a series of historical battles where numerically inferior forces had achieved victory through what human military doctrine politely called creative problem-solving, and what everyone else was beginning to recognize as terrifyingly effective applications of physics and psychology. Every species evolved to survive on their homeworld. That means every species has instincts, reflexes, and behavioral patterns that worked great for their original environment, but might not be optimal for combat against opponents who evolved somewhere completely different. Blip the Centauri raised his hand. But Instructor Chen, doesn't that mean humans have the same disadvantages? Maya's grin was sharp enough to cut metal. Absolutely. The difference is that humans spent 60,000 years figuring out how to compensate for our disadvantages by exploiting everyone else's. In the back of the classroom, a military attaché from the Korvaxi High Command was quietly updating threat assessment protocols for the third time that week. Similar conversations were happening in war colleges, strategic planning centers, and diplomatic facilities across the galaxy as an uncomfortable new reality settled over the established interstellar order. Humans, it turned out, were not the harmless primitives that initial first contact reports had suggested. They were something far more dangerous, a species that had learned to win fights against opponents they had no business surviving against, and they had been perfecting those techniques for millennia. The galaxy's military establishments were going to have to recalculate everything. Every tactical doctrine, every strategic assessment, every comfortable assumption about the relationship between strength and victory was suddenly in need of revision. And somewhere on a small blue planet in an unremarkable star system, 7 billion humans were going about their daily lives, completely unaware that they had just become the most sought-after military consultants in galactic history. Next question? Maya asked pleasantly.